Welcome to The People's View, a program dedicated to discussing local, state, and national issues and their effect on the American people. The People's View provides a platform for state representatives and national figures to present their viewpoint. Whether it's social, economic, or financial topics, you'll hear it on The People's View.
Hello and welcome to The People's View. This program is sponsored by the Nashua City Republican Committee, and you can learn out more about us by going to the website at nashuagop.org. And I'm Carl Seidel, and my co-host is Kevin Avard, and tonight we have Charlie Arlinghaus from Bartlett's Center for Politics.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Thank you for coming. We want to talk to you about your article in the Union Leader about the budget and the state budget.
Sure.
And how we don't have income to match the outgo planned.
Well, there's the budget is always an interesting process, and I think it's particularly interesting this year. One of the things I tried to suggest to people is that the budget, people often don't know this, includes two basic parts. The one is a giant spreadsheet, 1,000 pages of numbers, this line and that line. And it's all numbers, more or less. But going along with that is language, the narrative that explains a lot of those numbers and changes that are made. And those are due from the governor on February the 15th. This year, the governor gave her speech on the 14th, and she presented the first part, which is all the numbers, and she did not present the second part, which is the narrative. And what that means is that while we can follow a lot of what she did. We can guess about a lot of what she did. And frankly, for most of the programs, you can dig it out. There are a whole bunch of law changes that we don't necessarily know. I'll give you one minor example. We're going to end fiscal 13 with a shortfall, with a small deficit, or we would if we didn't do anything about it, because of a problem with the Medicaid enhancement tax that hospitals pay. And we have to make up for that. Her budget includes on one line of her executive summary the notation that $29.5 million will come from dedicated funds and other initiatives. I don't know what dedicated funds, and I don't know what other initiatives,
Could it be
because the second half isn't coming yet.
Could it be from the casino?
The casino's next year. The casino's a bigger problem. It's actually a bigger problem than that, and that's next year. But the casino's another example. So her budget is balanced with $80 million from a casino. And yet the casino bill has to be considered, and it's not, at least we don't think, going to be part of the budget, which is unusual. Usually any revenue change you make that you're counting on is part of the budget. And
can I ask a dumb question? And I'm sure it's going to be dumb. How can you make a budget based upon the casino bill or plan that way when it's not even legal yet? Or it's not allowed, we don't have it?
It's hard, and I'm going to try to give her the benefit of the doubt on this and say that, all right, let's say you balance your budget with a tax increase. Not my choice, but somebody decides to do that. You would put the increase in the law, and that increase only becomes effective if the budget passes.
Okay.
So that's reasonable. In this case, if you said, I'm going to use casino revenue, even though it's not legal yet, well, I'm going to make it legal by putting casino language in the budget, that would make sense. The real problem here is that it's not in the budget, so that it's a separate standalone bill, which is, in one of these odd instances in New Hampshire, the casino bill is in the Senate. The budget's in the House. So the House has to vote on whether or not to pass the budget. The House has to vote on whether or not to pass the budget before they see the casino bill, before they get to consider it. So they have to decide, sort of in advance, whether it's going to be in it or not. And I mean, frankly, I sort of feel bad for the Speaker of the House here, because Speaker of the House, Terry Norelli from Portsmouth, is a well-known casino opponent, has been for her time in the legislature. And she's been sort of put in an odd box where her people, there's a Democratic majority, have to consider their governor's budget with a proposal in it that they're not going to get to see and they don't like.
Is this like a Nancy Pelosi moment here, though, where you have to vote for it before you find out what's in the package?
It's, well, it could be, except the great thing about New Hampshire is that's not allowed. I think they can't have casinos, they can't have casino revenue in the budget, at least I wouldn't think so, unless they stick it in the narrative bill, which we haven't seen the draft of yet.
You know, one of the first times I met you up at the Capitol was in an HRA meeting, the House Republican whatever. And Alliance, thank you. Yeah. I remember it well. But you gave us a challenge, and I think it was 11 or 12%, you know, that we had to cut because it was necessary. It was a phenomenal challenge, and it got done.
It did. So 2 years ago, people will remember this, or actually probably everybody forgot, but we ended 2010 post-election, going into that budget season, the 2011 budget that would be considered, with an enormous shortfall, which different people estimated at different amounts. My estimate was that there needed to be almost $900 million of changes made to that budget in order to get it to balance. And in the middle of a very weak economy that's frankly still weak, my suggestion was that you shouldn't be raising taxes. Natural growth from existing sources is fine, but you shouldn't raise taxes because we don't want any less of any economic activity. And I remember the meeting because I said, it's a very difficult challenge. It's almost impossible for you to do. It's larger than any cut that's been made in New Hampshire's modern history. And it's a big task, but you can do it. It was done. The budget was balanced. There's a little tiny shortfall left at the end of this year for a completely different reason. But somebody said to me, probably not at that meeting, but later, said, well, what happens if we fix this giant problem and then we get kicked out of office because there are these tough decisions made, and yet they get to reap all the benefits? And my response to them was, you'll have done a good thing.
Exactly, and that's what happened. But
it is actually exactly what happened.
But they're not in as good a position as they thought they might be.
They aren't.
Even though we balanced the budget and had that ending. Right now, if I recall the numbers in your article, you're saying that they should plan on a $20 million increase and not the $500 more in expenses, or $500 million more in expenses.
Well, it's you know, the way any budget works is you have to balance your choices. If you want to spend more money, you have to have the revenue. If you don't have the revenue, you have to either not spend the money, or you have to raise the revenue. And she's decided to do a little bit of both. She's going to spend a little bit less. I think there's a huge problem coming in because they want more money for the university system, which got cut in the past, community college system, special education aid, local communities aid. You know, I'm sure Mayor Lozo would like more aid from the state. And there are all these programs. I outlined $500 million of initial priorities, and part of that was just spending what we spend today, and the natural increase in that. And I said they were going to have a very small amount of money. If some of her changes go through, they'll have more like $200 million. But they had to prioritize. So in the governor's budget, we think we know what some of those priorities are. About half the increased spending, half the new spending, as opposed to what we did last year, is additional money for the university system and the community college system. And most of the new revenue comes from $80 million in casinos that may or may not happen, and which won't be up and running, but they hope to get a licensing fee early. And the other half from a 30-cent increase in the cigarette tax, which is interesting because the cigarette tax, the Senate is already on the record as saying, no, we're not going to raise cigarette taxes.
And they're going to get rid of the House already voted against the scholarship education program too.
It's an interesting component. So the tax credit for the school choice program, the governor and some of the Democrats have said, who pushed this repeal, have said, well, we're going to raise the money. But the administration's own estimate of the revenue from that bill is actually repealing that bill, which I think in the end won't happen, but repealing that bill would cost them about $500,000 over the year.
That's what you were saying earlier.
Well, because there's a revenue side to it, because it's a tax credit, but there's also an expenditure side to it. And if you don't just say one or the other, both happen or both don't happen. And if both don't happen, because the bill was actually designed very carefully this way, right, with amendment after amendment to make it just so. And so she would have to repeal it, she'd have to spend, net spend another $500,000. So I think in the end that won't happen.
I think it was Anne Marie Timmons that said that if the casino goes in, that the police or the chief of police or the they're going to need about $2.5 million
Oh, for the state?
for the state
police?
extra, state police.
Well, that's where they tap the transportation fund,
And
Department of Safety.
And that would be for
That's
the
it.
first year, and then for every continuing year, it'd be $1.5 million.
Well, the interesting thing about casinos is that, and you could do 3 shows about casinos. I mean, and have 40 people on who all disagree with each other, because there's no question. What we do know is that if a casino goes in, and I should say that organizationally we're agnostic on a casino, we worry a little bit about if you spend the revenue in the general fund, because it's not necessarily a stable revenue source. It bounces up and down a little more than some. So I would prefer the money be dedicated somehow. But there will be additional police costs, particularly at the community level. There's some notion that the state, if it's imposing this, ought to pay some of those costs. There'll be additional costs to things like the Attorney General in terms of prosecution. There's all sorts of petty crime. Some smaller businesses will see an impact to their business. I mean, one of the things that happens is people transfer some of the money they were spending, their disposable income from.
Right.
I mean, I think the lottery director testified last week on this proposal, and they would expect their sales to take a hit, although their sales would also take a hit if they open a casino in Massachusetts. Because frankly, if you're a big lottery user, you could very easily become a big poker player.
I heard recently at Planet City, I guess one of their casinos went
Oh, yeah,
bankrupt.
Trump ones just sold for something.
So what happens when they go bankrupt? How does that help our budget?
It's a problem, yeah.
Wow.
Well, and I say, and so I tell people, if you're watching the casino bill, whether you think casinos are a great idea or not, and Chuck Morrison in the Senate, the senator from Salem, who's a big proponent of this bill, has talked about this before, where he said he doesn't want to use the money for the general fund. Because if you use, I mean, think about it this way, if you were to win the lottery, you wouldn't use that for an ongoing expense like your electric bill. You'd use it for a one-time thing. We want to look at, because casino revenue could be $100 million one year, 40 the next, and it bounces up and down. So let's not dedicate it, let's not stick it in the general fund and use it for general operating expenses. Let's dedicate it to something. I think they talked about dedicating it to the highway fund to build or rebuild some bridges and things like that.
Which desperately need to be done in the state.
That's an issue. That's a big issue in the state.
Yeah.
Was his just for that, or was it some part of it for education also?
Well, it's evolving now. So at one point, there was talk about just doing it for the highway.
Right.
The last version I saw had some money also for the university system.
Yeah.
Because when you think of casinos, you think of college, I guess. We had a casino night when I was in college.
That's the first thing I think
I don't know. And then they were going to dedicate some of it to economic development in the North Country. Although some people from some of the economically depressed areas in the western part of the state said, well,
What about us?
what about us? We're just a little further south than that, but can we get in on this too? And so it's evolving, and I think that 3 weeks from now, 4 weeks from now, where the money goes will look different than it looks today.
Interesting.
Well, it depends on how to win the voters over. That's what they do.
Well, the other thing is I don't think the House and the Senate agree. I think the House only supports gambling if it's used, like the governor uses it, to pay for general ongoing social programs or whatever. And the Senate is going to insist on at least some portion of it being dedicated. And the question is, can they resolve that? I think everybody thinks that gambling passes the Senate. And everyone thinks it's 50-50 in the House.
That's interesting.
It's going to be interesting to follow up. What other things are going on up there that you've been looking into that look like it's a problem coming up?
Well, I mean, one of the things you want to do in any budget is sort of keep an eye on where the money's going. We need to know more details before we really know what's happening in a lot of the budget, and try to figure out if there's money being shifted here and there. I mean, spending, I think if you're comparing on an apples-to-apples basis, where we compare the same categories to the same categories, goes up, it looks to me like it goes up 10.1%. My initial reaction to that, the governor has said 7.9, 7.2, but that's because there's some money that's being relabeled, I think. So we're keeping an eye on that to kind of see, 10% seems like a lot in a time when revenues are very flat because the economy is very flat. So I would like to see that rolled back. I think it will be, by the way. What she wants, the House will probably go along with. The Senate will want to come in less, and they'll have to negotiate. which makes June, when they do that final negotiation, very exciting.
I think I'll go away.
I think
It's a
I
bloody-
think that's good advice. You should
Yeah.
take that. Go to the
Yeah,
beach somewhere.
Yeah, yeah.
Let them figure it out.
Oh, it's very difficult. I remember when I started in 9/10, it was a shell game. They moved money around, and you didn't know under what shell it was.
In that particular year, not the last budget that we're just
Yeah.
finishing up, but the one before that, there were all kinds of things done for a number of reasons. There was a bunch of federal stimulus money that wasn't stimulus money. It was a state bailout. It was, here, use this for whatever you want, but use it to prop up your state budget. We spent that. It gets counted in an accounting way as not general operating spending, even though it really is. It's just the source is federal, so it's kind of different. They paid for some things with borrowing. We have a huge borrowing problem. We need to watch that. There are hundreds of things to keep your eye on. And then this week, the House, or at least one of the House committees, passed a big gas tax increase, which is also something to keep an eye on, which is going to be a huge fight.
Yeah.
But they also cut out the registration increase that was proposed, didn't they?
So my understanding is, so for about 4 years, we had a registration surcharge
Right.
when you registered your car. That was repealed in 2011. The proposal for a new gas tax, which I think comes out of Representative Campbell from Nashua, included originally a registration surcharge. Right. Now it's just the gas tax.
Right.
But it looks like as that passed the House, the Senate Finance Chairman released a press release attacking it. And so it looks like that's going to be, I think, a big fight in Concord.
Speaking of shell games, sitting on the redress committee when I was up there, one of the topics that kept coming up was this Title 4D money from the feds, obviously, and it basically it was given to the state, and then it goes into these 501c3s, and you can't track it. Are you familiar with that at all?
There's a more general problem. I don't know that I know the specific case that you were hearing, but there's a sort of a general problem when federal money comes to New Hampshire and gets distributed out. There's a great deal of oversight in Concord of money that we raise and spend ourselves. So New Hampshire tax money, the general fund, the education trust fund, the highway fund, our specific money where we're assessing fees on our citizens. We track it very heavily. People are very interested. When it's not that, it's like a secondary thing. People are like, well, that doesn't affect the general fund budget. I don't care. If it then goes out in the form of a grant, we were talking about grants off the air, and so many grants that we give, we'll spend $2 million for this. The grant is given out to the company, and we know that that's what happened. We know that $2 million went to them to do something.
Right.
But the follow-up doesn't happen. I remember in the mid-'90s, I was familiar with a planning grant at HHS to plan a healthcare plan. Mm-hmm. And at some point there was a spending freeze on. They could buy no equipment, they could do no travel. And the one vendor who was as a consultant in on this and administering this multi-million-dollar grant said, don't worry about it, we'll pay for it. And it was a way to get around the grant. And I remember at the time I said to someone, that seems a little odd. And they said, oh no, that's what you do because otherwise you can't spend that money. but no one cares what happens to that money.
Right.
And so we don't track. We don't follow up.
That's interesting because I think one of the things what happens is what we were finding in the redress is that certain things were happening in the court systems which were generating this Title IV money. It was giving them incentive to act a particular way. And so we wanted to kind of track it. So we had Ken Weiler come in and he said, yeah, well, we can track about $45,000 of it or something, but out of a $2 million, whatever. And it went into the system. And I was just wondering, is there any oversight over that? Who checks it?
Well, there can be. I mean, there's a level at which the Executive Council can oversee anything,
right.
Most expenditures. But there's a government that spends $5 billion a year. There's a lot to oversee. And so at some point you run out of time. For individual expenditures, it's starting to be tracked. My organization has a website which tracks essentially every check the state writes. But if the state's just writing one big check, nobody tracked. We go, okay, no, we gave $2 million to this guy. We don't know what he did with that $2 million. So that secondary tracking, it's a matter of people being overworked and not following it. But it's something that needs to be followed. And for years, the State Employees Association, the State Workers Union, was very intent on tracking that because they have this impression that we're using it to hire employees that then therefore don't have to be in the state union. Yeah, and they're like, we could do that cheaper. You don't know what they're doing with the money. Well, I agree with them. We don't know what we're doing with the money, so let's find out. But it's just one thing on the list.
Have you ever worked with the audit division up there? I mean, what they do in following up? Because one of the greatest disappointments I had when attending a HHS committee hearing once was to hear an audit report and a list of certain things, and the chair said, oh, well, what are you going to be doing about it, to the representative from HHS? Well, there's nothing, we're too busy to pay any attention to it. And they take care of, what, 40-some% of our budget?
It's, yeah, that's, the HHS is a huge part of our budget. People, I think a lot of people don't know, in fact, a lot of reps don't know, that there's a legislative budget, they call it a legislative budget assistant. It's actually an office with a lot of accountants and auditors and things. There's an audit division which performs dozens of audits a year. They do performance audits and accounting audits of various departments. And they publish, in fact, I think they published an annual report in the last 3 or 4 months where they list all of them and they do summaries of them. But you can go on the state legislature's website and look under the legislative budget assistant and look up audits. And they periodically, and eventually they get around to everybody, but they'll pick a department and they'll audit what they do and they find anomalies. Sometimes nothing happens because it's just, you know, they don't know exactly what to do about it. Sometimes very significant changes happen. I remember 3 or 4 years ago, they discovered with, I want to say it was with administrative services, that in some of the insurance contracts we build out, naturally the state government that takes out insurance on a lot of things, they weren't all being bid.
Oh.
And so the ones that bid, we got a great price on. The ones that we didn't bid, we didn't get as much of a price on. And so we started bidding more of them and they saved money. And that, you know, that led to a bidding process. I mean, frankly, Nashua has a great history in this. Is for decades, Nashua's executive counselor, Bernie Streeter for many years, and now Councilor Pignatelli, I think, is also interested in this, insisted on as many contracts as possible. They had sort of an anti-no bid bias. If a contract was no bid, they wanted to know why. Because they had the impression, and I think I agree with this, that everything should be bid, everything.
Right.
Unless there's a reasonable reason for.
It's hard to think of I'm sure there are 1 or 2, but if you're the guy doing the contract, you don't want to go through the hassle of the bidding, that's not good enough.
No, that's not.
But once in a while, you're right, there's some sort of public safety issue or something.
It doesn't necessarily have to go to the lowest bidder, though, correct?
It's the way it would work is that it's not necessarily low bid, but best bid.
Right.
Sometimes somebody's cheaper, but they're using different materials, or
Right.
they're not doing something, but you work it out that way.
Right, yeah, and that just keeps everybody honest, I think.
Well, yeah, and sometimes there's an urgency to it, as you said, safety or something like that, where you have to get the job done and there's only one guy that's ready to do it, or whatever.
A lot of times that happens. There will be contracts where almost nobody bids. The other thing to watch is that if contracts come in and it doesn't go to the lowest bidder, the people need to explain why, you know, the department or whatever. And by the way, that can be a decent explanation. Well, they offered something the other guy didn't offer, and that's why he's a little higher, but we're going to save money in the long run. Or, you know, you just need to make sure it's not somebody's friend.
Yeah.
How do you think the healthcare issues are going to affect people in the state?
Well, I think the big issue in Concord right now is the expansion of Medicaid.
Right.
And the federal government would like everybody to expand Medicaid. The theory is that they would pay all of the costs in the first 3 years. And I'm a little skittish about that because I don't believe them. The federal government says stuff like this. We have a lot of experience. In 1975, I think it was, they passed the IDEA, Special Education Act. And they really meant they were going to spend they were going to pay 40%. They meant it. But they didn't, and it's 17%, I think. It's always been upper teens.
Right.
And they just never paid what they said they were going to pay. Now, there may have been other reasons to do it, but they meant well, and they were wrong. The president said 100% for 3 years. During the fiscal cliff negotiations at the end of 2012, he proposed, as part of his negotiation, well, what if we went to a blended rate where we did almost 100%? but we blended a couple of rates together. And actually, a bunch of liberal fiscal watchdogs in Washington went ballistic and said, you're shifting costs to the states. And he's backed off on that. The thing is that I don't know if you're paying attention to what's going on in Washington, but they got fiscal troubles.
Do you think?
And they're not going away.
Right.
And so we'll always be on the chopping block. So I'm a little nervous about something that they think isn't going to cost money, and that at the end is.
This is what the Wall Street Journal calls the baby elephant.
The baby elephant, that's right.
I call it Indian givers. That's where we get they're the Indian give, the original Indian givers,
Yeah.
the feds.
So the theory, I love the baby elephant example though, because it's I'll give you a baby elephant and I'll give you the feed for the first 3 years.
Yeah.
And then after that, when it eats 3 times as much because it grew, I got nothing to do with it, and you're going to go bankrupt feeding.
And you won't clean up the mess that it
And that-
causes.
right, that's right. So there are a couple of governors who
Exactly.
have said, well,
That's
after
funny.
3 years, we'll repeal it if the money isn't there.
Right.
And that's not, it can't happen.
Well, what about the other part of it? There's some talk up there of putting all the state workers on the Affordable Care Act.
It's an
Which
issue.
is,
So our state workers have the most generous health care contract in the nation, by far. The National Conference of State Legislatures does a study every year on this, and we have very generous health benefits, which are much too generous for the federal health care standards. You can't be generous beyond a certain point. And if we just took everybody off of that and put them into Obamacare, we would save a lot of money,
Oh, they'll love that.
and they would all hate it.
You know what? That's a great idea.
I read recently that there's some
Oh my gosh.
supermarket, I think Workers Union, who is striking over this fact that their employer wants to put them
Oh, on that.
in Obamacare. And they're like, what? It's supposed to be good for everybody. And they're like, we don't want that.
Is this one of those unintended consequences because of an election that they probably didn't foresee?
No, they probably foresaw it, but they just ignored it.
Oh,
No, I think that the problem is that
Wow.
the people didn't think that. I mean, I think some people, when the federal health care law originally passed, really thought, some very naive people, really thought it was going to lower health care costs. And we're to the point now where the president admits that it's going to raise costs. The people who wrote the bill for him admit that it's going to raise costs a lot. And they're now saying, yeah, but there's other good reasons to do it.
Yeah.
Whereas at the time, no, we should do it because it's going to save everybody money. And they're like, well, we didn't really mean save money. We meant do other good things, even though it costs more. And buyer beware, and we need to beware. This is a bad idea.
I think that's going to be a huge wake-up call for a lot of state employees, a lot of state workers.
I think we won't see the effects of it for a few years, and it's like the Medicaid expansion. Somebody said, "Well, why would the governor put that in her budget?" And I said, "Because when we really see the financial club hit us, she's going to be done. It's not her budget; it's the next one, which might be hers too if she gets reelected. But that's down the road for somebody else to deal with, and we need to be careful when you're governor. Frankly, when you're a state legislator, realistically." Your first incentive is to deal with things that are going to happen this year. And things that happen 4 or 5 years down the road, it's harder to stay focused on. And particularly when you're governor, you're like, well, that's not I'll save the money now. And if the next guy has a problem, that's not my problem.
It's unfortunate.
Well, we did the right thing. When we were up there.
retired early.
Well, I already spent my $100. So.
But it is something up there. It's there's still fighting up there. As you can see from just some of the results in the last couple of weeks, that some of the stuff is.
There's a lot of fight still going on. Yeah.
Speaking of fighting, let's talk pensions if you got a second.
Sure.
How's that working out?
People don't realize that our pension system is one of the worst funded in the country, which is shocking given that we're in New Hampshire. But the unfunded liability is over $4 billion, and you add on to that a health care benefit that's another $600 million or so underfunded. You're pushing $5 million. There's a third thing which is not managed by the retirement system, but is part of DAS, where we don't have any money set aside. We just have an obligation. That's $2 million. All told, there's about $7 billion of unfunded liability. To put that in perspective, the state's debt total general obligation debt, the obligations of the state, which is higher than it's been at any time in its history, is just under $1 billion. The pension problem is just over 7. Well, the problem is people are living longer. The other problem is we don't take enough out of, if you are a state worker, of any state worker, teacher, many of the local workers who are in the system, et cetera, we don't take as much money out of your paycheck and match it with as much money. Those two things and the increase won't cover what we're going to pay you. We have
the
to,
investments that...
and the investments, et cetera.
Right.
We have to hope you
Die early.
So
Oh, God.
has anybody fixing it? I mean, we had a
There were some
committee.
changes. There were some changes made last year.
Right.
I'm sorry. There were some changes made in 2011 in a bill that was called Senate Bill 3. Senator Bradley was the original sponsor.
Yep.
Became part of the budget.
remember
Became
that.
law that way. There were some changes made that eliminate some gamesmanship at the end, where people take all their back vacation pay their last
Spiking
year,
and all that
it
kind of
counts as
stuff.
salary. There's a notable case of a police chief who retired, and his pension amount, which was supposedly 50% of his salary, was actually more than he was making, because he did some back pay and overtime to make it. So he retired at 120 grand, and he'd only been making 106.
And you can't blame them for doing that if it was legal.
The rules are the rules, and
Right.
he used them to the best of his ability.
was smart, right.
But what it did is it highlighted a problem.
Yeah.
Some of those problems were fixed, they helped, but our unfunded problem grows bigger and bigger. And at the end of the day, we're going to have to, at some point in the next 5 to 10 years, do what states like Rhode Island have done, Michigan have done, not necessarily, blue state or red states, but in Rhode Island's case, a state with a Democratic majority, Democratic treasurer pushed through, which there's some sort of sharing of the risk. Right now, the risk is all on the state. If things go badly, the state owes more. The employee, we take money out of your paycheck. That's it. You're done. But we need to move toward, in the non-public sector, everybody has a plan that's based on your contributions, not a promise.
If we don't fix it, can it bankrupt the state?
In theory, if we don't fix it, it could bankrupt the state. It would take a while, and we would have to turn a blind eye to it. We would have to pretend nothing was wrong.
Like kick it down the road for the next guy, you mean?
Yes. There's some worrisome thought that might happen. The governor has said she wants people to look at it and have a commission to figure out what we need to do. And I worry when governors want to have commissions, because commissions are great
And it costs money.
at delaying a problem.
Right.
Hey, why don't you guys go figure that out and then get back to me? And then I act like I'm doing something. And then when you get back to me, I look at you and I go, wow, that's serious. We
Yeah.
really need to do something about that. Let's figure that out next.
Okay.
And it just delays it and delays it. We need to stop delaying and fix
How
it.
long have we been aware of this?
Well, it's hard to say. We've had problems with the system. There were some accounting changes that were made to the system in the early 90s that were bad, that were a bad
Very
idea.
bad.
There were at the time 2 different ways of doing the accounting to figure out if you're fully funded. And we did one that no other state was doing, and that actually you're not allowed to do now under accounting principles. And that didn't work out too well for us. People suggest that that's the whole problem. It's actually a minor problem. There's actually some years where that made us look worse, and some that made us look better. But for the last 10-ish years, since the early 2000s, we've known there's a big problem and we need to do something. We just haven't done major things to fix it.
I know talking with Greg Hill, he was on the pension committee, and he was talking about, we're planning these long-term plans with the pensions, and, the sand's shifting every year, every 5 years. And it's hard to make these long-term predictions and plans to fund these programs, because there's so many changes that are going on. How can you realistically make these changes to fix the problem? And it was a good question that he brought up.
They do a big time horizon, and they make projections on what's going to happen with inflation, what's going to happen with payroll, what's going to happen with total number of employees for the next 30 years. And any of those numbers shifts for a while. The big guesstimate number they use is they guesstimate how much money the fund is going to return on average. We'll have some great years and some bad years. But what's the average going to be? We used to guesstimate that at 8.5.
Right.
We lowered that to 7.75. that makes the problem look worse because you're assuming you're going to get a lower rate of return and that compounds over time. Makes the problem look worse, but more accurate. Private companies, I talked to somebody who works for a major, a very large company, tens of thousands of employees in Greater Boston, who said that their actuaries made them lower because the private sector accounting standards made them lower their assumed rate of return on their company pension to 4. We're at 7.5. If we were to do that, we'd go from being 52, 53% funded to 20, 23. It's a problem, though.
And we'd lose our credit rating.
We have to, already this is putting pressure on our credit rating, and it limits our ability to borrow in other areas because bond rating agencies look at it and say, great, you don't have a lot of debt otherwise, although we're getting there, and you're getting a good interest rate because you're a good risk, but there's a giant 50-pound gorilla here that nobody's talking about.
As far as the investments, I mean, have we ever looked at the people who are investing the money for the state and try to make some adjustments there?
We've done some adjustments. Actually, my organization did some. The Josiah Bartlett Center did some work on this, where we thought, you know, I don't want to look at and say, all right, what'd you invest in? Was it a good idea to buy IBM stock? But what I did want to look at is
Solyndra.
Solyndra, exactly. What I wanted to look at and say, how are we doing compared to others? So we tracked for about 15 years. Where are we? And we compared it to, just for the sake of argument, the S&P 500 return, even though not all of our money is in stocks. And we track more or less with that. Some years a little better, some years a little worse, but close. And then we compared ourselves to their organizations that publish returns, to other government pension plans. And New Hampshire is in a range. We're in the middle. We're not the best. We're not the worst. We're somewhere in the middle. So we're not getting, which I think is where we ought to be. We're a little state. We're not going to be best. We don't have giant pots of money. We should never be the worst. And so if we're in the middle, that's fine. So what that means is that the problem is not how we're investing. It's structural.
Okay.
You think going to a 401k type of pension is going to be the solution?
I think at the end of the day, we have to. We have to go to something that looks sort of like a 401k. Where, now you can have more generous and less generous 401ks. There are 401ks where you take money out and that's it. There are 401ks where they match it. The university system right now, for example, in New Hampshire, has a 401k. And I remember my wife was at one point a college professor, and she, at UNH, and they took out, if you took out 6% of your paycheck, they matched it with 9%. Not topping it off, but it was great. I mean,
That's
we had Henry. She decided to stay home, but for 5 years, that was terrific. But it's a very generous system, and I only say that to say systems can be more generous or less generous. What works about that system, though, is it's very nice for the employees. There's no question, as is our state pension system. But the contributions are made immediately. There's no we'll pay you. It's put aside, and it's set with Fidelity or TICREF, I think in their case, and that money is yours. You own that asset. The problem right now is that asset you sort of own, but it rests in Concord with their New Hampshire retirement system. They're going to give it to you. They really are. I mean, assuming that we can get it fully funded, but you don't own the asset. And I think any solution has to have certainty for the taxpayer, so we know how much we're paying. But for the employee, the pension owner, they need to have ownership of the asset right away, so they know we're not going to pull a fast one on them.
No, I kind of agree. I think we're finished. We're getting right to the end of the thing.
We're sort of
it's a good
pushing
way
the
to, with these happy endings here.
Happy endings.
Well, we have to have you back in a couple of months to see when we get closer to the final budget in June. It's going to be an interesting month.
We'll know more then than we know now.
Well, yeah, I guess as soon as we go through the crossover, we'll have a better idea, but even more so, what kind of compromise is going to be made. I hate to be in on some of those budget meetings.
June is going to be a fun month when they make the sausage in the back room.
Yeah.
Well, thank you again for coming. We enjoy it. And thank you for listening in. Don't forget, if you want to find out more about the Nashua Republican City Committee, it's nashuagop.org, and we meet every second Thursday of the month at the Crown Plaza. Contact us if you want to suggest other people that we should be interviewing. And thank you again for listening in.